"If you don't leave with that dog, I'll call security," the manager said loudly, his voice echoing through the restaurant. Daniel Carson didn't respond. There are moments when respect isn't just a choice, it's a test. And that day, inside an ordinary restaurant, the test came disguised as ignorance. The Blue Water Grill was immersed in its usual Sunday tranquility. The scent of seafood lingered in the air as silverware clinked to the rhythm of casual conversations. When Daniel entered, few noticed his presence. His steps were firm, almost imperceptible, but his shoulders still carried the rigid posture of a former Marine. At 62 years old, his body bore the marks of battles fought long after the war. Beside him walked Rocky, a Belgian Malinois with attentive eyes and golden fur. On his back, his vest clearly read, "Service Animal." But to Daniel, that dog was much more than that. He was a trench brother, a shield against the ghosts that still whispered from the deserts of Afghanistan. They sat quietly near the side wall, where the traffic was lighter. Rocky lay at Daniel's feet, motionless like a silent shadow. The waitress smiled politely as she brought water, but her eyes hesitated when they landed on the dog. Without saying a word, she disappeared through the door leading to the kitchen. Soon after, the manager appeared, young, dressed in a suit, with an air of authority poorly practiced. "Sir, we don't allow animals here. I need you to take the dog out," he said, loud enough to attract curious glances from neighboring tables. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Calmly, he pulled a laminated document from his jacket pocket. "He's not just a dog. He's a service animal. He's authorized by law." The manager didn't even glance at the paper. "Rules are rules. We have health standards. Customers may feel uncomfortable." From the back of the room, a woman with large glasses nodded loudly. Finally, someone with sense. A dog is a dog, even with a uniform. Daniel stared at Rocky. The animal remained unshaken, trained to ignore human tension. Then, without raising his voice, he replied, "This dog saved me in enemy territory. He placed himself between me and death. I'm not leaving him now because someone prefers to ignore his value." The response was met with silence. But the manager crossed his arms. "Then you know what to do." Rising with dignity, Daniel walked to the exit, Rocky by his side, as always. No words were spoken. Only uncomfortable glances followed their departure. The world outside seemed indifferent to the humiliation, but something was about to change, and the restaurant had no idea what would happen in the hours to come. In the park, Daniel reflected on his relationship with Rocky, remembering their missions in Afghanistan. Thor, intuitive and loyal, had always been his greatest emotional support. Although invisible to the world, the scars of war deeply shaped Mark's life. In his pocket, Daniel carried an old photo, protected by a faded plastic sleeve. In the image, an injured man lay on the dirt floor. Beside him, a vigilant dog, covered in dry bloodstains, stood guard, eyes focused on the horizon. The setting, Afghanistan. The red marks on the animal's paws matched Daniel's blood. Rocky had never left his side. For hours, he waited for rescue, enduring the suffocating heat and imminent danger. On Rocky's vest in the photo, the insignia of Bravo Unit, K9 Division, was clearly visible. An elite troop operating in high-risk areas, specializing in rescue and neutralization of threats. Rocky had been awarded twice, something few humans had achieved. Daniel lightly touched the photo with trembling fingers. "We're out of combat again, aren't we, brother?" he murmured. Rocky, in response, rested his head in the veteran's lap. The gesture was the same as in the mission days, comforting, silent, firm. Around them, the world continued. A bus crossed the avenue with a sign that read, "Honor those who protected your freedom." A bitter irony. Just minutes earlier, he had been thrown out of a restaurant for trying to have lunch with the only living being that had given him safety since the end of the war. A hurried mother passed by, pulling her son by the hand. The boy looked curiously, but no explanation came, only fear disguised as caution. Daniel was used to it. Between being invisible and being judged, he had experienced both. Prejudice was no stranger to him. But what still hurt was the silence, the absence of empathy. While checking Rocky's next medication time, he remembered that the dog had also been hit in the same explosion that had wounded him. They shared more than scars. They were survivors of the same story, bound by something neither time nor ignorance could erase. The city seemed to ignore them as time passed. Daniel watched the restaurant from a distance, obscured by the park's shadows. The sign shone normally, as if nothing had happened. Inside, the plates likely continued to be served. The conversations returned to their usual rhythm, and no one spoke of the man with the service dog anymore. He placed a hand on his aching knee. The stress of the situation was starting to take its toll physically. Rocky, beside him, noticed the subtle change in his breathing and pressed his body against Daniel's leg. No command, just synchronization. Further ahead, a group of students crossed the sidewalk, laughing loudly and holding up their phones. One of them pointed at Daniel with a mischievous grin. "Look, the old soldier and his magic dog," he mocked. Another added sarcastically, "Bet he made up some war stories just to look like a hero, like my uncle, who pretends to have trauma. So he doesn't have to work." Daniel heard it all. He heard, but remained motionless. Words from strangers were nothing new. The shallow judgment came easily to those who had never had to hide from explosions or count the seconds until a helicopter arrived. Rocky remained calm, even in the face of the laughter. He was trained to recognize real threats, and those empty voices weren't worth reacting to. Still, the comments echoed in Daniel's mind for a few minutes. He slowly rose from the bench. The sun was starting to set, casting longer shadows on the sidewalk. He needed a quiet place. He could still feel the heat of the earlier moment at the restaurant, the public humiliation wrapped in protocols. As he crossed the street, his eyes met a billboard illuminated with a short phrase. "Heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they walk with paws." Daniel involuntarily smiled, a flicker of recognition amidst the indifference. In his pocket, he still carried the old photo, the same one he had kept since returning from Afghanistan. It was more than a memory. It was proof of courage, of companionship, of everything Rocky represented. They found another bench, this time under a tree, further from the bustle. Daniel settled again, offering water to Rocky with a small aluminum canteen. Both were exhausted, but at peace with each other. Once again, it was the world around them that didn't know what to do with that connection. And while the restaurant returned to normalcy, something invisible was preparing to break the silence. A subtle but powerful movement had already begun, and very soon it would leave that place forever marked. The day seemed ordinary, but Daniel knew something was about to change. The streets of the city followed their usual rhythm, indifferent. The sound of traffic, the hum of pedestrians, and the small distractions of everyday life did nothing to alter what Daniel felt in his chest. He knew something big was lurking, and this wasn't the first time he'd felt it. In the park, the silence between him and Rocky stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of peace earned after so many battles. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds around him blend with his memories. Occasionally, the ghosts of the past would return to haunt the seconds that passed, vivid images of dirt roads in the desert, explosions, and of course the constant presence of Rocky by his side. However, it was hard to ignore what was happening outside his quiet bubble. The news of the incident at the restaurant, like an uncontrollable fire, was starting to spread. In the distance, a woman passed by with her phone in hand, capturing images of the moment and likely sharing the story. On social media, she was just one of many, and soon the outrage and judgment would gain momentum in small conversations. Daniel slowly stood up, feeling the pain in his knees and the heavy weight of his thoughts. The world outside was about to become a battlefield of its own, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. The next morning, the weight of the incident hung over Daniel like a dark cloud. He tried to push it aside, but it was impossible. The footage from the restaurant was now viral, shared thousands of times, each view adding fuel to the fire. People were angry, some were supportive, but many were judging, questioning, and condemning him and his loyal companion. The spotlight was on him, and he wasn't prepared for it. The barrage of messages started flooding his phone, some with encouragement, others with hateful words. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. His scars were no longer just on his body. Now, they were laid bare for the world to see, scrutinized by those who couldn't understand the weight he carried every day. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the screen of his phone, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He thought about responding, about telling his side of the story, but the words didn't come. Instead, he felt trapped by the relentless tide of opinions that flooded in from every direction. Rocky lay at his feet, as always, his calm presence, a comfort in the chaos. Daniel scratched the dog's ears absent-mindedly, grateful for the simplicity of the companionship they shared. Rocky was always there, steady and unwavering, and for a moment, Daniel allowed himself to take solace in that bond. The following days were a blur of media attention, public opinion, and the growing pressure of the situation. Daniel had to do something, but he didn't know what. He couldn't just let this pass. The injustice, the prejudice, the way people were treating him and Rocky. It was too much to ignore. He reached out to a lawyer, someone who understood the complexities of the law and the challenges faced by veterans like him. Together, they began to strategize, preparing for the inevitable legal battle ahead. Daniel knew this wasn't just about him. It was about all the veterans and service animals who were unjustly treated, ignored, or dismissed. At first, the process felt daunting. The legal jargon, the paperwork, the hours spent discussing the case, it was all overwhelming. But through it all, one thing remained clear. He wasn't alone. Rocky was still by his side, as steadfast as ever. With his lawyer's guidance, Daniel made the decision to share his story publicly. He wrote a statement, pouring his heart into it, explaining the realities of living with PTSD and the vital role Rocky played in his life. It was raw and vulnerable, but it felt like the right thing to do. The statement was released, and the response was swift. Some people understood, others were still skeptical, but the dialogue had begun. As Daniel's story gained traction, the ripple effect was felt far beyond what he had imagined. Support poured in from veterans groups, animal rights advocates, and everyday people who had experienced similar discrimination or who simply wanted to stand up for what was right. The public's opinion was shifting, slowly but surely. News outlets began covering the story in a more empathetic light, focusing on the bond between Daniel and Rocky and the injustice they had faced. The more people spoke out, the harder it became for the initial prejudiced incident to be brushed aside. While the legal battle raged on, Daniel began to notice something remarkable happening in his own life. People were starting to treat him differently. Strangers offered kind words in passing, and a few even stopped to thank him for sharing his story. They didn't always understand, but they respected his courage. But the battle wasn't over yet. Daniel knew that the fight for justice wasn't just about winning a case. It was about changing attitudes, changing how people viewed veterans and service animals, and making sure that no one else had to face the same kind of discrimination. The court case finally came to an end, and the ruling was in Daniel's favor. The restaurant had been found guilty of discrimination, and a public apology was issued. It was a small victory in a much larger fight, but for Daniel, it was a step in the right direction. The legal victory was important, but the true change came in the hearts and minds of the people. The conversation about service animals, PTSD, and the treatment of veterans had shifted in a meaningful way. Daniel knew that there was still work to be done, but he also knew that the world was a little bit better than it had been before. As for Daniel and Rocky, their bond had only grown stronger through the ordeal. They were a team, and nothing, not prejudice, not hate, not even the weight of the world, could ever break that bond. Daniel stood in the park once more, Rocky by his side. The storm had passed, but the work was far from over. He was ready for whatever came next, knowing that, together they could face it all.